Welcome, everyone. I'm Patrick Daly with the Providers Council. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar in partnership with Curtis Strategy. Today, our panelists will be discussing unlocking potential through organization design. A little bit of background about our presenter, Eric Curtis. Eric is the president of Curtis Strategy, a consulting firm focused on designing breakthrough strategy and innovative business models that lead to future growth, relevance, and sustainability. He is looking very much forward to presenting you the information in today's webinar. A couple of technology-related items before we begin. You will be on mute for the duration of the presentation, just to cut out any background noise. You can feel free to type any questions that come up into the questions box on the sidebar, and we'll get to them at the end. We will be recording this, so once it is complete, I will send that along with the slides. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and now I'll turn it over to our panelist, Eric.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the Providers Council for affording the opportunity to present today, and thank you for spending your what could be lunch break for the webinar. Really appreciate that. So just to set the stage a little bit, I'm going to go through several different things. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about this macro landscape, explore what's happening, and try to relate that a little bit to organization design and why things are moving in that direction in terms of areas of focus. Give you a little background on what is organization design, how you can use it, what the benefits are. But then I'm going to walk you through a specific example of something that we do, which I believe a workbook PDF will be provided to the participants and attendees, along with the slides. And then during the presentation, if you have questions along the way, please write them down, and we will, look into the question chat section for your questions to be able to answer those at the end. So we should have about 15-20 minutes for questions. My hope is that this presentation provides you a framework for how you can look at reshaping the operations to evolve, align to strategy, grow, or maybe just deal with the mass amount of disruption that's been happening. And so a lot of the trends that we're going to talk about were trends that were happening before COVID-19. And as many of you are aware, COVID-19 pretty much strapped a rocket to the pace of change, and things are moving at an exponential pace right now. And business models are disrupted, service models are disrupted, funding is being disrupted, and there's a lot of lack of clarity. And so as you go, this also affords you the opportunity to kind of take an in-depth look at your organization and see how you might be able to align it to the future to become more relevant. So just a little bit of background here, some of the major shifts that we're seeing, and I just want to touch upon each of these briefly in the coming slides. Is that everybody on this call is from the health and human services world, and as we've seen over the past several years, the funding model, the business model is being disrupted or transformed, moving towards this healthcare reform, accountable care, managed care model. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of organizations kind of look towards organization design, is because as change in service delivery or funding delivery changes, looking internally at operations changes are necessary. But one of the major reasons that organization design is important is because as we grow, organizations become more and more complex. And we've seen massive advancements in technology solutions that allows us to manage that complexity, whether we're dealing with electronic health records or customer relationship management systems like Salesforce or HubSpot, or even thinking really big scale with enterprise resource platforms that kind of connect everything. And so as the complexity and size of organizations grows, the technology solutions need to match that. And of course, as you bring on new technology solutions, there's a new need now, or an expanded need for talent. And before COVID, there was a workforce crisis, and now we're trying to figure out what the impacts on workforce are in the human services sector. But one thing is for certain, as organizations look at service delivery models, virtual, hybrid, blended, whatever that may be, new skills are going to be required. And that's an opportunity when you're looking at an organization design project or thinking through some of the stuff we're going to walk through, assessing some of your talent and your staff to identify if you are aligned to the future or if there's some gaps there that you may need to fill. And as we push towards digitization and moving to digital services, maybe like peer-to-peer technology solutions, the idea that our business models are being transformed through technology is a significant opportunity. It's an opportunity to innovate. It's to use this crisis that we're in this year to be able to think differently about how to deliver services. And then obviously COVID-19 is probably the biggest thing to happen to the health and human services market with regards to just multiple levels of issues with government budgets, funding cuts, service disruption, and then putting organizations in a state of emergency where they need to look at either cost savings or maybe they even need to look at closing the doors in some aspects. So let's dive in. Let's talk a little bit about what is organization design, why are these trends important as it relates to it, and really the best way to define organization design is that it's about building your operations to effectively and efficiently deliver value and services. And so when we think about how disruption has occurred, it's an opportunity to look at your organization holistically. And a couple just points of psychology as we think through and before we get into talking about it is this concept of water seeks its own level, right? If you do what you've always done, you get what you've always gotten. And maintaining the status quo is not going to achieve growth. And over time, operations tend to seek a level of equilibrium based off of how things are structured. And maybe you can fluctuate a little bit up and down within that. But as you bring new levels of capacity to the organization, you increase the water levels. For example, we worked with an organization, they were a membership-based organization. One of their goals in their strategic plan was to increase membership 10%. Now, that was an arbitrary number picked because it was a nice round number to increase membership 10%. However, they had never increased membership by that much in the time period that they were looking at. In addition to that, they didn't make any structural capacity, internal organizational operational changes that would allow them to achieve outside of the norm results. And so you'll hear a lot as we connect strategy and structure. The other point that I really kind of want to drive home is that organization design is about bringing higher levels of order and organization to your nonprofit, all right? And so as you look at expansion, as you look at growth, as you look at maybe cost savings or developing efficiencies, a lot of times you can achieve significant amounts of growth by looking internally first. Because if you don't build a solid foundation that can support your new levels of growth, the infrastructure will crumble. And we're seeing that a lot when we deal with organizations that are using mergers and affiliations to grow or are investing significantly in things that are going to catapult their growth 50%, 100, 200+% over a period of several years. And they really need to take a look at their internal infrastructure to make sure they're bringing higher levels of order and organization to be able to hold and support the growth. So when we look at org design, and before we get into a little bit about what it is, here are the benefits, and they're pretty substantial. And these are obvious. These are also one of the projects that we find most interesting, but also most challenging because they're very complex projects where we're looking to discover efficiencies, ways of delivering service, doing business more efficient, or jumping in to try to find ways that an organization can save money. Right, this whole process also impacts the culture, and it allows you to elevate the culture to a new level of performance, because as you build things that we'll talk about like role clarity or priorities or metrics, which build accountability, that has a tendency to increase performance. And we'll talk a lot about how production is the basis of morale. And as you measure certain performance indicators and things of that nature, you get a higher level of morale within the organization. And then lastly is capacity. One of the major benefits is capacity, and we hear this a lot. One of the common things that we hear from CEOs is that the staff are overwhelmed, right? We don't have any time to do anything, and capacity becomes a major issue. And when we flip the switch from using the concept of adding staff to add capacity and look internally to say, how can we do things better to create capacity with the resources and talent that we have, right? And that's what org design is really about. And so it really covers 4 different areas, from strategy to structure to systems and staffing. And strategy is kind of the glue in the context of how we're going to look at designing an organization. And obviously, structure is the operational model by which it's designed, and we'll give you some examples there. And then systems, which are the glue that holds everything together from a data sharing, logistics management system standpoint, as well as the staffing that you need. So if we take a look really quick at strategy, most of you have probably gone through, or maybe you're in the process of updating, given COVID-19 and 2020, your strategic plan. The strategic plan is the context and the guidelines for conducting organization design. And as you have new strategic initiatives that might require resources, they might require new ventures, new types of operations, that is really important to know as we move into the other parts of the org design process, because that creates the framework for thinking. Structure does follow strategy, and a lot of times when we see organizations struggle in implementing their strategic plan, they didn't kind of take that step 2, which is diving into looking at how they're structured, the systems that they have and the talent they have, to see if those things align to strategy or will afford better implementation and execution of strategy, right? Because again, it's about bringing that high level of order and organization to your operations so it can support that growth. And if you have big aspirations as part of your strategic plan, exponential thinking does require transformative change. And as we all know from trying to implement change, it is very difficult, it's very challenging, and it requires a lot of tough decision making, because you're changing things internally from a systems, staffing, and structure standpoint. All right. And one thing to just note as part of 2020 is that there is a lot of disruption, obviously, that's happening with different programs and different services. So a lot of organizations are looking at cost savings, either to survive or as a means of figuring out the new profit and loss model for specific staffing ratios or program operations. And that may be just an update to the strategic plan. But after we move from kind of developing the strategic plan, which many of you may have, that second step is structure and looking at the analysis of the organization, the way it's designed, how do you want to grow, and things of that nature. And so we all are familiar with org charts, right, which is a visual design of an organization. Right? It helps us to think visually about the flow of business, where business is categorized, captured, et cetera. But there's different ways to design an organization that may be best for how you want to grow or your strategic or to align to your strategic initiatives. Right? One of those ways is functionally designing the structure. And when you think of job functions, you can think of major categories. Think of operations or programs, HR, finance, IT, or marketing, right? And so that functional alignment keeps expertise kind of in those silos, and they each have their own purpose. And it's a very simple way to design an org chart when you do it and look at it functionally. But sometimes as an organization, is pushing the growth boundaries, and maybe they're moving throughout Massachusetts or throughout New England or even nationally, they may have to look at designing a geographic org structure. What that would look like is if I was based in Boston, but I wanted to open up an office in Springfield, I might have 2 org charts with an executive director at the Boston office, with operations, with HR, with marketing, et cetera, and the same type of organization design structure in the Springfield office. And then they would report up to a chief operating or chief executive officer. And so you can look at the geographic design and the functional design together as you grow as well, and look at maybe a geographical spread for programs, but a functional design for administrative supporting services. And so these are just different ways to look at how you design a structure to be able to align to the strategic plan. What organization design also allows you to do is spend time to work on the organization. You know, a lot of times we're putting out fires, we're managing the day-to-day, we are in it. And this provides that opportunity to step back, get an objective perspective, and work on the organization, working on it to advance, improve, develop, whether that be an operations model or even from the staffing perspective. But without that time, you continue to have difficulty seeing the big picture and the potential for change that will align to the future. And the second part of organization design, or I should say the third, excuse me, are your systems, right? So these are the big systems, your big IT systems that kind of glue everything together, from how data flows to how logistics are managed, how you coordinate from an intake to an assessment to delivery of service, and then all the supporting functions that go along with that. And as we're dealing with change, you know, whether we're dealing with structural change or staffing change, change itself is sticky, right? And trying to change an individual on a one-on-one basis is very, very difficult. And so what we like to do is identify the systems that will govern the behaviors. So rather than think about changing a person, change the systems that govern that person's time. And what that allows you to do is create the processes, the policies, and kind of the flow of how things interact operationally to and through systems like customer relationship management systems, electronic health record systems, enterprise resource systems, et cetera, right? Because a lot of the organizations, maybe even on this call, have achieved a significant amount of growth. And as you grow, the complexity of your infrastructure changes. It gets more and more complex. So not only do we need systems that can manage that complexity, but we need the talent that can manage that complexity as well. And so as you step back and then you assess the talent that you have or don't have, you're trying to fill in the gaps, and you might not have that knowledge internally to be able to answer questions around good IT governance and IT strategy, right? So looking at the future needs of the organization, you might have to acquire those resources to help you build a systems infrastructure that can support your growth. And this is what's going to connect all the information, all the departments, and all the data together to be able to use in an orchestrated manner. But as we all know, IT systems are a lot of money, they're a lot of time. And what's most important is getting it right from the beginning. And having that expertise at the table helps you to make more well-informed decisions as you're looking to procure systems that not only will meet the needs of where you're at now, but the next 5 to 10 years, which is how long you'll be caught up in these systems. So the next piece is staffing. As we jump in and we look at the importance of staffing as the last step, this is where we're going to spend the most amount of time in the presentation, because this is where we're going to give you a specific example of some of the things that we do in a project that will help you better manage your team or better think through the team now and the needs of the future. So when we look at staffing, we want to be able to, when we're conducting an organization design project, be able to assess the team, which will allow us through that assessment, which we're going to walk you through in a moment, organize the structure, when we look at it geographically, functionally, service-based, or matrix-based, and then structure the team within some sort of preconceived notion that aligns to strategy. It will also allow us this assessment tool that we're going to walk you through to increase role clarity, build priorities, and drive and increase accountability. So we call this the job post assessment. And really where it comes from is, having been in the military, you would stand post, and you were given a very specific set and very clear set of orders. And a lot of times today, we don't have clarity in our roles. What we have is something called a job description. And a job description is more of an HR and legal tool to be able to have. And that job description might have 65 bullet points on it. And one might say that I have to be able to lift 35 pounds, and the other one might say that I have to smile. And then, my favorite and everybody's favorite, do whatever else my boss says. And so we realized that some of the lofty, vague language that was in job descriptions and just the way they were just being used from a legal or HR perspective wasn't creating the clarity that individuals needed to do their role, but not only that, to assess how to improve the organization. And so we created the job post, and the job post consists of three things. The primary purpose, meaning what is the purpose of the function, right? Think about it as writing a mission statement for your job function. Second is, what are the top 5 key activities of the position? And then lastly, what are 3 to 5 key performance indicators or success metrics? Right? And so I'm going to walk you through just a quick process that we go through, and then show you some of the worksheets that we use. And this workbook will be available to you. And it's a great opportunity to do something like this with your team. Because what it's going to do is, this job post assessment is going to provide you insights to whether you have team members that think at the strategy level, the operational level, or the tactical level, or maybe everywhere in between. It's going to tell you a little bit about their thinking about their job, and then are you on the same wavelength of expectation in their role and your role as a supporting manager. It's going to tell you, do they know how they are being measured? Do they understand how they're performing? And so the biggest benefit to the job post assessment is it's going to also provide insight as to where you can identify and find capacity, right, without adding any staffing. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So the process is, we're going to dive into real quick. But this is what a job post is. This is what it looks like. It's a very simple tool, right? And it may seem overly simplistic. However, what it does is it creates a lot of clarity, accountability, and priority for the team. And it can be as simple as a one-pager like this. And I'll show you a completed one in a second. So the first step of conducting the job post exercise, and if you're doing this in person, you might be doing it on a Post-it with Post-it notes. If you're doing this virtually, you might be doing it in Excel. If you wanted to hand out worksheets, you can do it on the ones that we'll be providing. But the first step is having your team members write down all their roles and responsibilities. And ideally, they're doing this without a job description present, because when we started our job, we were kind of doing everything on our job description, but things change over time, and new things get added to our plate, and priorities change, and maybe job descriptions don't get updated. And so this is an opportunity to kind of assess the as-is as to where all the staff think they are focusing their roles and responsibilities. And what we want to see next, which is step 2 of the process, is for them to identify the top 5 roles and responsibilities that take them the most amount of time. So if they had a list of 40 or 50 things of roles and responsibilities on the list, next to 5 of them, to identify which ones take the most amount of time. So the top 5, and time number 1 is takes the most time, and that could be out of a work month, year, doesn't really matter. It's important for you to understand that, because as we go through the exercise, we're going to compare and contrast things to what they identify as the things that take the most amount of time. So the next step in helping to kind of assess their perspective, which is one of the most important, and will also tell you how their position aligns to others throughout the organization, is to create a primary purpose. Right? So a primary purpose, as I mentioned, is like creating a mission statement for the organization. It's about who you serve and what value you create for them. What it's not is it's not a list of roles and responsibilities, right? We already had that on the previous the previous list, right? So if you're adding comma, 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 you're probably creating a list of roles and responsibilities. And what we really want to capture is the purpose, which is based on value. So we would have team members, your staff, write down a statement of purpose. What is the primary purpose to your job function? And then be able to kind of have some discussion and examine that to make sure that their perspective is clear and it's aligned to what the expectation of that role is. So once we have a purpose, we're going to send them back to this worksheet that has all their roles and responsibilities on it. And we're going to ask that they identify the top 5 priorities that fulfill that purpose. And here's where we get a gap, is when we compare and contrast what they identified they spend their most amount of time on, those top 5 things, versus what the top 5 priorities are. And we see a gap there. And when we do this activity across a whole organization or multiple different people, it starts to tell a theme. Maybe we're having too many meetings. Maybe communication is unclear. Maybe there's a lot of areas that are consuming time, or fires that need to be put out that we can address systemically across the organization that will create capacity. And as we create capacity, we have to understand how we're going to fill that time. So for example, if we go through this process and we're working with teams, they identify their priorities and their time, and we can say that there's several things that are unneeded activities or unneeded things that are causing us to waste time. So we can go eliminate that. Now the challenge in doing that is when you free up time, and let's say we have a 40-hour work week, and I free up 10 hours a week for certain team members, if they don't have a list or a clear vision on how they would fill that 10 hours with high priority activity, it's going to get filled with low priority activity. And so as we create capacity within a system using the existing resources, we also want to identify what we're filling it with in terms of valuable time and energy. And then lastly, the third part of the post process, and this is really a difficult step, especially in the world of human services, is to be able to create 3 to 5 key performance indicators or success measures. These allow us to determine how a position is measured. Right? Ideally, it's trending data, so we can look at things that worked and things that didn't work. But one important thing to point out is that the metrics must be in control. The person that is assigned the metrics must be in control of them, meaning they need to be able to move the needle up or down on what they're being measured on. We don't want to measure people on things that might be unfair to them or outside their sphere of control. Right? So this is a very important part. And when you put this post together, right, you get a primary purpose, top 5 key activities, and key performance indicators. What this allows you to do is to gamify management, right? So if you want to think of organization design, you're thinking about it from creating an organization that can operate and deliver value and services more effectively, more efficiently. In order to do that, the people that work there need to be operating more efficiently and effectively. So if I can gamify management where I have total role clarity and triage the list of things that might be on a job description or in people's heads as what they perceived as most important, triage that down into the top 5 things that they focus on, not to say that that's the only thing they focus on, and assign performance indicators, I can increase production. I can get more done because people are becoming hyper-focused in their function and they know how to win and succeed. So if they know how to win and succeed, and I'm gamifying management, If production is the basis of morale, morale goes up. All right, so I took a swing at creating a job post for the marketing director of the Providers Council. So when we look at the primary purpose, human service leaders throughout New England interested in the Providers Council might be their primary purpose. And it's not an increase in membership unless they own that function, but it's an increase in interest, because you can't control people's decision making, but if you generate enough interest, you'll inspire action towards becoming members, towards sponsorship, towards event participation, etc. And then put together, just really quick, 5 examples of key activities: develop and implement a unified marketing and communication strategy, direct and manage the brand through all printed materials, website, public locations, and digital channels. 3, provide marketing direction and assistance to support membership, programming, sponsorship, PR, etc. Develop and submit press releases to publications that reach the intended target audience, or hire, train, supervise, and develop staff, right? And so maybe some of the things that the marketing director is some of their success measures that they are managed by are the potential new members that come in, conversion ratios, event attendance, webinar attendance, etc., are an indicator of their job. And so if I do this across an organization and everybody has this priority and role clarity, I can then manage from it. And what it allows me to do is have intentional conversations with my team members and my staff about their key performance indicators. Why did this go up? Why did this go down? Right? And really understand that data so that you can repeat the good things and avoid some of the things that are maybe detractors in their performance metrics. So there's quite a few benefits of organization design. We've talked a lot about them, but I think one of the things to point out is that it's a challenging journey. It requires a significant understanding of the scope of changes that you're going to be making and the decisions as leaders that you're going to be asked to make. And those decisions are major structural changes. Those decisions might be around, investment in huge IT systems or changing of IT systems, or it might be around staffing and bringing in new people and moving out people that might not be aligned to the strategic direction of the future organization, or even funding sources. So there's a lot to consider in decision making when you get to this point of looking internally at your operations. And so there are significant benefits. You can achieve lots of cost savings. And I do apologize. It appears the landscapers decided to come right as we're delivering the webinar. So I'm just going to hook in here my headset to try to block out some of that noise. Hopefully that is working on an audio basis. But I did want to keep the presentation pretty short so that I'd be able to answer the questions that you guys have. And so I know that we'll be taking a lot of questions, and hopefully Eliza or Patrick can help me read through some of those as you may have, but also my email is here if you have any questions on organization design, things that it might entail, because it's a very complex process that we could spend hours discussing. And so Patrick, I don't know, do we have any questions?
Yeah, great question. So right now we currently have 2 questions, and for all the attendees, please feel free, if you do have questions, continue to add them into the questions section. I'm currently looking at it right now, and I will pass it along to Eric. So Eric, our first 2 questions are, pull it up. Oh, a lot of screens open, sorry. What leaders do you typically work with when facilitating organization design projects?
Sure, great question. So if the project is something that we're doing for the entire organization, obviously we're going to be working with the CEO very closely on decision making and reporting back. But the ideal partners that we're working with would be like a chief operating officer and a chief HR officer, or somebody within HR, because a lot of what we're doing is, again, restructuring. And when we do that, there's a staffing impact, there's a communication impact, but also there's us working in partnership with a client to be able to deeply understand each functional area, program, or person or system. So we typically partner heavily with chief operating officers and chief HR officers.
Wonderful. How much cost savings can be achieved?
So it really depends on, you know, the goals of an organization and what they're looking to accomplish. And in some cases, there's actually investments that are made because they need to design a new arm, a new branch, a new department, et cetera. And so looking at how do you stand something up like that and allocate the resources and investment in capacity over 2 to 3 years to stand something up. But you know, the ones that we're helping to restructure for either the purposes of cost savings or just improving the operational capabilities, you know, there's a lot of room to save money over time and save costs, whether that be, you know, we've found cost savings in poor IT governance, where people had the ability to buy different systems across different departments. And we found that there were significant redundancies in the systems being used, but hundreds of thousands of dollars kind of going out the door that was unneeded. Or vendor procurement, where we're working with too many types of the same vendor, or we have a lot of staff doing very similar things, and does it make sense to kind of get a few of them hyper focused in key areas? And so, you know, we've had the ability to work with universities, health and human services and associations, and many other types of nonprofits, and thinking through how they restructure. And typically we're working with, you know, the medium to large size organizations, because they're the ones that have more of a complex infrastructure that tends to need to be streamlined.
Great, those were 2 wonderful questions. Do we have any more questions from the attendees?
Where would they type those? In the question box?
Yeah, so if they look over on their side dashboard, it will say dashboard, attendees, polls, handouts, chats, and there should be a section where you can put in questions. So feel free and go ahead to do that. It's right
And
underneath.
I'll be PDFing the presentation and the workbook out for the post exercise to the Providers Council, and they can share it with the attendees here. Anyone have any specific questions about, you know, their organization, things they're trying to achieve? I did want to save, you know, quite a bit of time to be able to answer any questions that you may have. So,
oh, we got one. When do you bring your board into the process? It was asked by Alan.
Sure. So it's a great question, because you're going to embark on a significant amount of change or potential change. But what you want to avoid is your board getting involved in operations, right? They're a governing board. And so giving them a heads up that you're embarking on this for specific strategic reasons, whether that be cost savings or alignment to the strategic plan, what have you, and then just reporting out at the board meetings progress and answering any questions they might have. What you don't want to do is get the board involved in the work, because that's dragging them into the operations, and you know that can be a recipe for disaster. But I would involve the board right from the beginning intent of thinking about doing it, because many board members that actually we've worked with have been through restructurings, have been through this, and so they understand the concept. And as long as the rationale, the strategic rationale behind it is solid, then they typically are in support of things like that, because you're improving the infrastructure.
That's great. We have another question. I often wonder how to plan for this. We are in the midst of growth and trying to figure out what our current staff can handle and what staff we need to bring on. Would you recommend a pause and reflection or figuring this out in weekly planning meetings as the growth is happening? That was from Marlene.
Great question, Marlene. So we get asked the timing question all the time. When's the right time to do this? Before strategic planning, after strategic planning? It's so, and the answer varies so much. For example, we worked with an organization that I would consider, a pretty large size human service provider, and they asked us to conduct strategic planning for them. And after kind of some initial intake discussions and things like that and conversations with the team, I recommended that they do organization design first. And the reason I recommended that was because they were operating with an infrastructure that was too archaic to even conceptualize building on. And they really needed to bring that up to speed from a talent standpoint to a structural standpoint. And then we wound up doing planning after and made some additional tweaks and adjustments. But I guess the challenge is that organization design is so massive, it's so complex, kind of breaking it down into small chunks and identifying that these are the goals that we want to achieve. So we're going to start in the programs, then we're going to move to some of the administrative areas and kind of roll it out. It usually takes a few years, maybe a year, 2 years, to kind of look at doing things start to finish, depending upon how big of an organization you may have, but always keeping the conversations, or I should say allocating the time to be able to work on the organization is always a benefit, because the staff will be able to give you feedback that will help you better make decisions as a leader. But also, I think, being able to have an objective view and step back and listen to the questions your staff are asking, ask them specific questions, and engage them at a working on the organization level will also tell you if you've got the right people at the table that are able to manage some of these complexities. Again, as you get bigger and you grow faster, your organization gets more and more complex. And so the ability to task manage complexity over long distances of time, right, is one of the factors to consider when you're thinking about leadership or having a conversation around management capability and things of that nature. So it's great that you're growing, and I think a lot of organizations are looking at strategic growth through mergers and affiliations, and that requires excessive organization design. Like, how do we fit the functions together? Do we have duplication and things like that? And the more you can conceptualize it visually, through org charts and things like that, the more you'll be a stronger influencer in the conversation, because you'll have thought through levels of detail and design that others may have not. And the same with bringing that to your staff in a meeting, allowing them the time to think through, hey, okay, we're pushing to a digital hybrid services or telehealth and things like that. How are we doing that differently? How can we improve, make that model more efficient, knowing funding's not going to be there forever at the capacity that it is? So you put those questions to the team, and then you find out whether or not they have the ability to answer them or the ability to go find the answers. And then you can start thinking through structure, systems, and staffing.
All right, we got 2 more questions in. The first one is from Duncan. When capacity and accountability is not as strong as the enterprise needs for the future, how do you ease into that to get buy-in?
Can you ask that one more time?
Yeah, sure, no problem. It's from Duncan. When capacity and accountability is not as strong as the enterprise needs for the future, how do you ease into that to get buy-in?
So if you're asking how do you approach the conversation internally, or if you're asking how do you embark on that journey to improve those things, I'll kind of answer from those 2 contexts. If you're looking at embarking on that conversation and and addressing that conversation internally with people that maybe not are open to it. It's just got to be head on. And part of the way that you do that is to create the gap, right? By identifying here's where we could be and here's where we are. Here's a potential solution to bridge that gap, right? Because if you pose a problem without bringing the solution, the ideas, or at least something to incubate off of that straw man, people tend to get offended versus realize that you're working towards the improvement of the organization. And when we're dealing with org design, we don't want to point fingers at people. We want to make sure that we're dealing with the problems that arise because of lack of accountability or lack of urgency or lack of, what systemic problems, cultural problems are those things causing? And let's address those and create the project around that. But if you're looking at, from an organization design standpoint and getting started, you just go full bore. I mean, part of the challenge, and again, back to the decision making, is org design will change a culture, right? It will change a culture because maybe there's certain people in the organization that are toxic to a culture or they look busy versus productive. And when you get into these org design conversations, those folks stand out. And as you increase the level of accountability, they stand out even more. And so the best way to address it is just dive right in. But the problem exists around decision making, because decisions are going to have to be made as you go. And that's the hardest part. If I came in and said, we're going to take and move your HR department from this design, and I'm not even talking staffing, just this structural design to this one, that's a major challenge. If you had 10 things on your plate and I was to take one away and add a new one, you would look at it as a perceived loss. Okay, so there's a lot of psychological effects that go on that you just have to hit head on to realize that to get to the next level of growth, of relevance, of sustainability, sometimes it's peeling the Band-Aid and driving people to and through it, and it can be very difficult. So I hope that answered the question.
All right. On the note of the question around timing and reflection, is organization design an ongoing process that evolves with the organization or a point-in-time process? What's the right balance between function, optimization, and change fatigue?
Yeah, so I think we're always changing and evolving, and I forget the quote, but once you've completed change again, so you get used to it. I think that an organization should always be looking. I mean, this is what the C-suite is for, right? This is what the CEO, the COOs are for, the chief HR officers are for, is to step back and look at how do we operate and improve the infrastructure differently. Now, they might undertake one massive project in one given year to redo a whole department or a whole organization, right? But over time, they should be having those conversations very frequently, or are allocating that time so they can make small incremental changes. So they don't in 5 years have to do another big reorg. They're addressing them as they go. And you look at the disruption that happens in an organization design project. It requires a lot of capacity, a lot of time. The results are typically very positive from a production standpoint, from a morale standpoint, from bringing new people in and shaking up a culture standpoint. And so you can do that all at once, which we do all the time. But after that, continuing the discussion on a frequent basis allows you to make small changes that stack up over time, so you don't have to do these massive, huge projects.
You mentioned transitioning to a digital hybrid model as an example. Does a robust organization design process necessitate an individual skills audit? Is it easier to invest in building internal skills or recruiting people who already possess the hard skills but lack the institutional knowledge?
It's a good question. When you're looking at, if I'm understanding the question correctly, do I invest in developing my staff for digital capabilities? And the answer is probably both. I've worked with a lot of human service agencies that probably one of their biggest gap is technological sophistication, whether that be at a chief information officer, a chief technology officer level, whether that be at an in-depth understanding of the new digital marketing landscape that we're in, right? Because gone is analog marketing. We are in a digital space, and not many people may understand that digital space and the opportunity that exists in it as well. So I think when you're looking at investing in your staff, the challenge is going to be in leadership, and does leadership, how big of a gap does leadership have, or certain managers have, from where you need to be to where they're at now, and how long will it take to close that with training and development? And in some cases, right, the jump is so exponential that you realize I have to go out and hire somebody new, or hire a position that's of a higher caliber. And in other cases, it might be small and incremental that you can fill with some in-depth advanced training on whatever solutions that you're trying to afford. So I think it ranges there. That is a big challenge as you embark on some of these initiatives, and you do. I implore you to try the job post exercise with the team. It's a very simple exercise, but it tells a lot about the people in the room, and it answers a lot of questions that you may have had in your head about, do we have the right people, and then that might even lead to these questions around, do we have the right structure? Because the systems questions tend to get answered when you bring in that expertise.
All right, that sounds great. Do we have any more questions from the attendees? All right.
Well, I appreciate everybody taking the time to be on the webinar. Thank you so much for spending your lunch break with me. If you want to connect, my email is here down below, eric@curtisstrategy.com. Happy to take any questions, and I'll be getting Eliza and Patrick this deck as well as the workbook to send out to the participants. And thank you again for participating today.
All right, thank you everybody, and we hope you have a great day.